And here we are again, the two Jacks. It's episode 9. I think I said 6 last week. It's just happening so quickly that I'm losing count. Not that I'm great at maths, but I am here today with Hong Kong Jack. G'day, Jack. How are you?
G'day, Jack.
Tell us what's going on in Hong Kong COVID-wise.
Well, the case numbers are about 1,000 a day at the moment, which is very high for Hong Kong.
That's not zero COVID, Jack.
Well, we've moved on from zero COVID. We've now got the dynamic zero COVID. A lot of eye rolling around town. No one seems to quite know what it means. It rather struck me as like the new blue Omo, which is the old Omo with blue flecks in it.
But it's dynamic.
It's dynamic, yes. That's right.
So policy-wise, there's no change, I gather, in terms of...
Yeah, things are starting to move. They're no longer requiring people to go to Penny Bay for contact tracing if you're a close contact.
All right.
Because they're having to shift some patients, COVID patients. If you get COVID in Hong Kong, you get sent to hospital. And they're filling up the spaces. So they're they're sending some asymptomatic people out to Penny Bay to do their time there.
Yeah.
And that means we're starting to move towards home quarantine, for home isolation, for close contacts, etc., etc. It's all going to start moving very quickly.
So you're basically getting existing facilities starting to overflow.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And
So
I've always said I'm happy to go and do my time in isolation when Penny Bay's full and the airport thing's full, and I can happily go to the Mando for a week.
Well, that sounds a lot better than Penny Bay, to be honest. Where the food is occasional, the electricity unreliable, and if you've got a mobile phone on you, it probably won't work.
Yeah, well, the Mando's a very good hotel. I'd much prefer to be there.
All right, so it looks like zero COVID is a bit of a fantasy, like we thought it was with Omicron. Wrote a bit about this in the Australian Today, looking at Hong Kong and Western Australia, where you really do have this sense that you're just kicking it down the road, leaving a problem for another day.
Well, we're certainly going to test the limits of zero COVID here, I think.
Yeah, it looks like 1,000 per day. I mean, that probably takes you up to maybe about 20,000 cases in total since the pandemic began in Hong Kong, I'm guessing.
About that.
Yeah, about 20,000. Well, look, I'll tell you what.
But they're doing that many a day in New South Wales.
I was just going to say, New South Wales would do that before lunch.
And New South Wales is about the same population as Hong Kong. So, when we get up to those kind of numbers, it's hard to see how their existing arrangements can hold.
And while those problems exist, in New South Wales, and they're not without particular difficulties and a lot of serious illness and deaths and so forth. The sky hasn't fallen in, and people are going about their business pretty well. Meanwhile, in Canberra, well, there's lots going on there, but just over the last couple of weeks. Scott Morrison was made aware in questions about text messages sent about him. One from a senior member of the Morrison cabinet in conversation with Gladys Berejiklian, where Gladys said he was not a very nice man, Scott Morrison not a very nice man, and this apparent senior member of the cabinet said he was a bit of a psycho, Jack. Is that basically a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister?
Well, the thing that struck me about it was that having cabinet ministers, fellow cabinet members, have that opinion about you is just par for the course.
Yeah.
I mean, this has been going on forever. Generally in politics, your most virulent enemies are on your own party, not on the opposition.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to the Hawke days, Paul Keating referred to Bob Hawke, your pick as our greatest Prime Minister in living memory anyway, was old Jellyback, wasn't he?
He was indeed known as Old Jellyback to Porky. And it goes on. There was the famous telephone conversation, Jeff Kennett and Andrew Peacock.
Not safe for children's ears, by the way. That conversation.
When John Howard was the leader of the opposition, and I believe Jeff Kennett raised this morning at Andrew Peacock's memorial, and noted that Andrew was complaining a couple of days later that they were both on the telephone call, and Andrew had lost his job and Jeff didn't.
Yeah, well, and Jeff was probably the biggest offender.
He was easily the biggest offender.
Obscenities thick in the air, and he lit
some fairly derogatory views about the leader of the opposition.
He was John Howard at that stage was the leader of the opposition, and of course his Attorney General also referred to him as, well, he always denied it, but that lying rodent.
But this is a bipartisan thing. If you go back to what the Kevin Rudd's cabinet members finally fessed up, they thought about him some years after they deposed him.
Parental advisories required around the communications around Labor members of Parliament and what they thought of Kevin Rudd. We better be careful. I suppose the one who we better be careful because Kevin, Jesus Christ, he listens to. I think he's got some sort of Google search function where wherever his name is mentioned, he'll go and check it out and see if it's worth sending off an angry letter. God knows, I've apologised to him too many times already.
Perhaps we best better be safe and say some of them didn't like him a lot.
Well, I think the benchmark for this really was Billy McMahon, who, if we go back that far, probably the most despised Prime Minister within his own ranks of all of them, certainly in living memory.
Generally thought to be Australia's worst Prime Minister.
Generally thought. There's a fantastic book which I'd recommend to listeners called Tiberius with a Telephone. And look, I'll pop some of that. I'll pop up the details on that. It's a terrific book written by a great fellow who deeply researched Billy McMahon and had a look at him. But this is Paul Hasluck, a very, very witty fellow. Jack, who became Governor General, of course, he'd been a senior member of the Liberal government going back well into the Menzies years. And this is what he had to say on Bill McMahon. I confess to a dislike of McMahon, he wrote in 1968. And then later he said he was disloyal, devious, dishonest, untrustworthy, petty, cowardly. All these adjectives have been weighed by me, and I could not in truth modify or reduce any one of them in its application to McMahon. So 30 years later, he reflected on what he thought of McMahon and couldn't come up with a change of mind.
And they were cabinet colleagues for a dozen or more years.
Yeah, so there you go.
So the thing about the coverage of the text message brouhaha, I found a little amusing is that none of the Canberra journalists, the political journalists, seem to raise the obvious point that this is common.
Yeah. It's not just that it's common. I mean, I guess it's sort of a gotcha thing. Peter Van Onselen introduced it, and they do it for kudos, of course. Do it for kudos and viewer numbers to release these stories, and the timing of it was, fairly. I mean, look, how long had he had that?
He had his own problems, shall we say?
Yeah, he does in fact have his own problems, but I won't get into those right now. Yeah. But the issue I'd probably say about this is that for political watchers, this means a lot. For everybody else, and that's 90% of the electorate at least, this is just a shrug of the shoulders. Because
people understand this is how the world works. They know that if they play in the same cricket or football team with somebody or netball team, there'll be people who don't like each other.
Yeah, and I suppose might offer opinions on them that they don't necessarily believe. That they might just have a heated moment with someone, but look, it's not going to affect the result of the election. Let's put it that way.
No.
You know, there were some screaming headlines and so forth last week, but really it's not going to affect the election. What it does, though, is it doesn't allow Morrison to have that clear air to prosecute his government's achievements, whatever they are.
But that might be a good thing. Because whenever he gets some clear air, he seems to make the situation worse.
Yeah, he tends to foul it up very, very quickly. Now, look, there's another story going on, Jack, and you know much more about this than I do. I'm a very innocent member of the media, but there are shenanigans at that global news network known as CNN. Don't tell me people who work in media are actually shagging.
Well, it seems that they are. And the story first came to light when the president of CNN resigned. The official reason for the resignation given was that he was having a consensual relationship with a senior colleague.
An affair.
And he hadn't disclosed that. And this seemed to me, losing your job as president of the company seemed to me a bit heavy-handed. But then it emerged that CNN became aware, or became officially aware, when they were questioning the president with regard to the Chris Cuomo resignation or dismissal.
Yeah, so Chris, just to explain to some of our listeners, Chris Cuomo, very heavy Democrat name, that one.
His brother was the governor. His father was a governor before that.
Yes, that's right.
A good Italian-American stock from New York.
Yeah. And Chris is, shall we say, a CNN commentator.
He was, yes.
Yeah, he was,
and he had his brother on every week to talk during the COVID thing, and it was a lot of brotherly love and a little bit of light banter. And then it emerged when Andrew's position as governor came under fire because of sexual harassment allegations. That Chris was doubling up as a CNN commentator and as an advisor to his brother, without having disclosed that to the network. So they punted him.
That's pretty murky, isn't it?
They punted him.
Yeah.
And Jake Tapper, a fellow CNN commentator, he thinks the problem with the president going was all to do with Chris Cuomo, that he had been disappointed in how much money he'd been offered and was behaving like a terrorist.
So it looks very much like he's pulled the pin on the hand grenade and then just rolled it under the table in the boardroom.
Yeah, and it gets better. What happens when good friends fall apart, Jack? Don Lemon, I never work out if it's Don Lemon or Don Lemon.
Yeah, we'll go with Lemon.
We'll go with Lemon. He's a bit of a lemon. Anyway, he and Chris Cuomo used to claim that they were like brothers.
Yeah.
And there's a recording that shows Lemon saying, "How do we get past this perception that this is the bad guy winning?" Referring to his former blood brother, Chris Cuomo. So it's all very amusing. But the best thing about the whole story, I think, is that despite all this falling out and people getting sacked for having consensual affairs, the bloke who's still got his job is the bloke who had a J. Arthur on a Zoom call.
That is rhyming slang there for a masturbatory practice, for those who don't know. And so Jeffrey Toobin, it actually became part of the lexicon for masturbation that you were when you were having a sly one off the wrist, you were tubing, but only when you're on a Zoom call.
Yeah.
So Toobin, that was extremely funny. And his return was hilarious.
I'm all for forgiveness, but how do you keep your job after that?
Yeah, look, his return to the airways was just hilarious.
Yeah, the look on the face of the poor person who had to interview him and talk about it.
It was an awful mea culpa, and then look, would you shake his hand? Would you shake his hand afterwards?
Well, the woman who was interviewing looked like she was definitely afraid she was going to catch something from being across the desk from him.
Yeah, God love him. He's back on the airwaves. All is forgiven, and it tells you that if you want to have one off the wrist during a Zoom call, probably nothing will happen to you if you're in media. More serious matters now. Now, Jack, over in the Ukraine. Well, perhaps it wasn't that serious because the French president has jumped on a burner and turned up in Moscow for a bit of a chat with Vladimir. And I got to say, the most impressive part of it all was the table. It was enormous, wasn't it?
He
It was the
did get to
biggest
speak
table
at
I've ever seen.
He did get to speak at the big table, didn't he? You know,
It was a big table to the point where you'd have to use semaphore. They were sitting at either end. You'd have to use semaphore to communicate. Very big table, very lavish.
It's like those cartoons you used to see of the Queen and Prince Philip at the other end of a mile-long table having breakfast. You know,
it was a big distance between the two. What happened when Macron came away was a bit controversial in that Macron said that Putin had made reference to a number of agreements, international agreements in relation to the state of play in the Caucasus that go back to, I think, 2007. And Macron said that Putin had acknowledged these treaties or agreements, and Putin said, "I don't know what the man's talking about." So there seemed to be, maybe there was a problem there with the translation. I don't know.
Do you think Macron was over there to try and solve the problem, or was he doing a bit of domestic politics?
Well, he does have an election coming up, which we're going to get to in a little way, in a little while. In fact, it's our next topic. So yeah, you would think Macron is not popular at the moment. Needed to have a bit of a win. And I suppose it was a win while there was clearly some misunderstandings and perhaps some misinterpretations of what had taken place. At least Putin did accept that there was, I guess, the potential for a diplomatic solution.